Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christopher Giannopoulos, President and CEO of the Woodlawn Cemetery and Conservancy. Welcome to the Woolworth Chapel for Woodlawn's third Legacy Lecture Series. This series is an educational and cultural initiative with the primary mission to preserve and share the deep histories and untold stories of those interned at Woodlawn. To formally introduce our speakers and open this afternoon's program, please join me in welcoming the chair of the Woodlawn Conservancy, Dr. Carolina Vega Ferrer.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third in our Legacy Lecture Series at Woodlawn Cemetery and Conservancy. As Chris said, we launched it last year with a lecture on the extraordinary musical legacy and life of Maestro Johnny Pacheco by his wife Maria Elena Pacheco, moderated by one of our Conservancy directors and friend of the Pacheco family, the Honorable Jeanette Ruiz. We're happy that Jeanette joins us today. The second lecture this past fall highlighted Woodlawn notable Olivia Walker, the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, led by her great-granddaughter, Olivia Bundles, who is another longtime friend and supporter of the Woodlawn Conservancy and an esteemed colleague on the board of the Conservancy. Olivia Bundles shared excerpts from her latest book, Joy Goddess, Olivia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. And the lecture was moderated by Eric K. Washington. Eric is another longtime friend and supporter of Woodlawn, who will also guide today's lecture, and we appreciate him very much. Thank you so much, Eric. Today's lecture will focus on the life and legacy of Woodlawn notable Rudolph Fisher, an extraordinary scholar, renowned in both the sciences and the literary world as a celebrated physician, radiologist, novelist, and key literary voice of the Harlem Renaissance. Rudolph Fisher's story and contributions to American society have been captured by acclaimed historian and author Kevin Magruder, who is here with us today. Dr. Magruder is an associate professor of history at Antioch College, and in his upcoming biography, he captures the life and the legacy of Rudolph Fisher, and he joins us here today, and we're delighted. Thank you again, Dr. Magruder. To lead us in today's conversation with Kevin Magruder, I'm happy to introduce to all of you Eric K. Washington. Eric is a distinguished historian and author of the book Boss of the Grips, The Life of James H. Williams and the Redcaps of Grand Central Terminal. Eric also serves as historian for our Where Harlem Rests project, funded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a series of tours and events highlighting the Black notables buried here at Woodlawn. Eric's research and work on this project culminated this year in his authoring of the booklet in your packets today, Where Harlem Rests at Woodlawn Cemetery, and you each have received a complimentary copy, the first to receive it. We hope you will enjoy reading it as I have. And now it is with great pleasure that I turn the program over to Eric Washington and Dr. Kevin Magruder.
So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Kevin Magruder is Associate Professor of History at Antioch College. His research explores African American institutions, urban history, particularly racial residential patterns, and LGBTQ history. He is the author of Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, 1890 to 1920, and of Philip Payton, the father of Black Harlem, and the editor of Home at Last, the collected writings of AIDS journalist Leroy Whitfield. He's currently researching and writing a biography of Harlem Renaissance writer Rudolph Fisher. That last project holds particular interest for me. For the past 6 years, I've chaired the Biographers International Organization's Francis Frank Rowland Fellowship, an annual award supporting works in progress that deepen our understanding of Black experience. In 2024, we were delighted to select Kevin as one of 2 fellowship recipients for his project Rudolph Fisher, Harlem's Interpreter. The recognition was well-deserved. Despite Fisher's importance to both American literature and Black intellectual history, he has never received the full-length biography he merits. A physician, scientist, novelist, short story writer, and playwright, Fisher occupied a unique place in Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s. His dual careers in medicine and literature made him one of the neighborhood's keenest observers and one of the Harlem Renaissance's most insightful interpreters. Few writers captured Harlem from the ground up more vividly than Rudolph Fisher. So I'm delighted to have Kevin Magruder with us today to help us see Harlem through Fisher's eyes. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Magruder.
Rudolph Fisher. He was born in 1897, died in 1934. He was born in Washington, D.C., and a lot of the images that are available, I'll talk about it in more detail. There are not a lot of family photographs, so a lot of the photographs are public photographs, and so this one is a little bit different. You may have seen him in this, but might not have known who he was. This is Langston Hughes, in order left to right, Charles Johnson, E. Franklin Frazier, Rudolph Fisher, and Hubert Delaney. This is 1925, kind of what's considered the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. So he's right in the middle of that. This is that same gathering, but it shows how diverse that audience was in terms of gender. And Fisher, in childhood, he grew up in Providence, and he was a brilliant student. And Providence, at the time he entered high school, had 4 high schools, and there was one that was a college prep high school, and that was classical. And that's where he graduated. And in many of these pictures, you'll see he's the only Black person there. He's in the front row. This is the yearbook committee. This is the Glee Club. He was a very talented musician. He played piano, arranged music. He was a serious musician. He attended Brown in Providence, and classical was in some ways formed to create that pipeline to Brown, and so he followed that. He was an honors student there. He gave the class oration on graduation in 1919. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa when he graduated. He and Fritz Pollard, the professional football player, were the only Black members of that class at Brown. And from Brown, he went to Howard Medical School. He got a master's at Brown after graduating, and then in 1920, enters Howard Medical School. Howard and Meharry Medical School in Nashville were the main producers of Black doctors at that time. In 1924, he married Jane Ryder, and these are pictures of her. They had similarities. They were both children of pastors. And the picture on the right is, I interviewed Jane Ryder Fisher in 1992. And the article appeared in the Black Scholar, and this is the photograph that went with that article. Fisher entered the literary stage the year after he graduated from medical school, and with him a short story in Atlantic Monthly that appeared in the February 1925 edition. A year later, he got a fellowship at Columbia to do research, and that's what brought him to New York. In New York, he and Jane moved to this building, which no longer exists. It's at the corner of 145th and St. Nicholas Avenue. And so the long side of the building is the 145th Street side. For those who are familiar with Harlem, the Bowery Savings Bank built a building that replaced that. And I moved into that Bowery Savings Bank building in 1987 and lived there until 2012, until I moved to Ohio. So when I interviewed Jane Ryder Fisher in 1992, we had the same perspectives on the neighborhood because there were changes, but a lot of it was similar. Paul Robeson was a good friend of Fisher, and he lived in this building as well in the 20s. These are other pictures. They have one son, Hugh, that Rudolph Fisher did not like the name Rudolph, so his nickname was Bud, after after the cartoonist of Mud and Jeff, Bud Fisher. His son was Hugh, and he gave his son the nickname of the New Negro. He was born in 1926, and these are pictures of Jane and Hugh, and then Rudolph's older sister, Pearl, who was very involved in literary circles. And I hadn't determined if she actually published, but she was very involved in literary circles in the DC area. Eventually, as a radiologist, Fisher opens a private practice on 7th Avenue, right at the edge of what's known as Stryder's Row on 138th Street. And it was, I believe it's that second building from the right. And then the taller building, as you go to the left, he eventually closes the private practice at the beginning of the Depression and becomes superintendent for the International Hospital, which is still there. That's now, and so that's 7th Avenue between 138th and 139th. And I believe Iris House has that property now. Fisher published over 12 short stories, 2 novels. His first novel, The Walls of Jericho, comes out in 1928. And from me and from my interest in race and real estate, there is an element there. The key figure, one of the plot lines is he's moving on an all-white block in Harlem, and his house gets bombed. And I suspect that block, from the description, is a block that I lived on Hamilton Terrace, and that kind of kicks off that story. That's 1928. In 1932, he publishes The Conjure Man Dies, and that's really one of the earliest mystery novels by a black author. And so he was very prolific while he's also working as a radiologist. By the early 30s, he and Jane and Hugh, they moved to Queens, and this is their home on South Road in Queens. And that's what I have, but I'd be glad to use that as a kickoff.
No, that's wonderful. Thanks for the pictorial overview. I appreciate that. I want to go back, I think, to the very first one, because it's an iconic photo from the Harlem Renaissance era. And I know many of you have probably seen that photo of the 5 gentlemen. What's the context of that? What brought them, what was their connection to each other? Maybe just a little bit more about what they had in common or not, that was sort of integral to this period that it's really in this year, from the issue of the survey graphic, where the Harlem Renaissance is kind of coined and everybody's kind of running with this idea. What brings them to the roof, and who is the host? Whose roof is that?
David Leverenz Lewis, in his book, When Harlem Was in Vogue, that came out in the 80s, he talks about, well, why a Harlem Renaissance? And his argument is that, since black people have been in this country, we've been advocating for our freedom and equality, but we often face barriers. When we protested, we faced barriers. World War I, black people thought, if we fight, that will settle it for us. But the summer of 1919 was Red Summer because of all the lynchings that happened across the country. And what Lewis argues is that civil rights leaders began to look at an alternative strategy of the arts, which we were in from the beginning, and that didn't seem as threatening to white people. And so they began to look at ways to promote the arts. The pivotal event for that was a March 1924 dinner at the Civic Club on Fifth Avenue, Lower Fifth Avenue. And Charles S. Johnson, who is in this picture, he's the second, he's behind Langston Hughes, was then head of the National Urban League. The Urban League had a magazine called Opportunity, and so he decided to use Opportunity to promote literature, in addition to the other things that Urban League tends to focus on economic development, jobs, but he felt literature is another strategy toward equality. The dinner in March of 1924 initially was inspired by Jessie Fawcett's publication of, I believe it was her first novel, There Is Confusion. And there are different stories about what happened, but it seems that Charles S. Johnson used that as an opportunity to expand it and invited up-and-coming Black writers, in addition to Fawcett, and publishers, other white writers, and use that event as a way to get them together. There was about 100 people there. I haven't determined, I'm hoping to determine this summer whether Rudolph Fisher was there. He's still in his last year of medical school, so he had other things, but he was in New York quite a bit. And when you look at photographs, I have not seen a photograph from the Civic Club. So when you look at photographs about the Harlem Renaissance, you tend to see photographs from this event a year later. And what this event was, this is on the rooftop of 580 St. Nicholas Avenue. And that's at about 139th Street, and very near where my friend Dr. Bill Sorrell lives. And the host, one of the hosts was Regina Andrews. And she had two roommates, Luella Tucker, and let me just get the other name correct. I don't see it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
So Anderson was the librarian, right?
she was a librarian at the Harlem Branch Library. And because of, this is right near City College, and her apartment with her two roommates kind of became a way station for people coming to New York, and they even called it Dream Haven. And the impetus for this event, I believe, is another dinner. This was in May of 1925. It was much larger than the previous one. Opportunity is again at the center of it. They had created a competition, a literary competition. Langston Hughes, the person in the front of this, got first prize for his poem, Weary Blues. And so that was the evening. I believe this is the morning. They had a party afterward, and this is going into the next day. And when I interviewed Jane Ryder Fisher, we talked about this photograph, and one of the things I remember her saying is she didn't know there were women there. And this is the only picture I had seen until the New York Times, March of 2024, they published this picture. And this is a very, much more interesting picture.
Yeah.
You know, the 4 men, 5 men, that's kind of traditional. But this kind of gives, the reality to the role that women are playing. And if we're going to talk about this picture being about the Harlem Renaissance, that women have a very important role in it. And this is from the New York Public Library. I'm not going to go through everybody who's there, but if you Google New York Public Library, they have the picture and they have everybody identified. They mistakenly identified the man at the right. That's E. Franklin Frazier, the sociologist who in the 40s really hits his stride. He's involved with the book that becomes known as American Dilemma. He writes The Black Bourgeoisie. He's identified in the public library as Charles S. Johnson. That's not Charles, that's E. Franklin Frazier at the far right. And so it's a party. And there are people who know each other. Rudolph Fisher is in it. So when I think about James Ryder Fisher's question to me, like when I saw this picture, it's like, oh. So Rudolph Fisher is in the back. this doesn't have a actually the pointer can't quite get to it. He's in the back, and there's a woman in a white dress in front of him. That's Regina Anderson. His hands are through her waist, which he's a married man. So I'm trying to say, what? So I think that's what he had a reputation even before they married as being a handsome man about town. And I think this is what Jane Ryder Fisher, like almost 70 years later, was saying that I didn't know there were women there. She's not there. Pearl is there. His sister is there, but she wasn't. So anyway,
I think thank you. Yeah, I think it's great, and so I can't see all of them because of the glare. But I think it's also like any gathering. Somebody would say, "Let's get a picture of these 5." That seems to have happened. So I was very curious as to what their relationship was to each other, and it was all kind of a mix of. I mean, Langston Hughes is already kind of a dynamo who's coming up. Rudolph Fisher's kind of up and coming.
And Jesse Fawcett is in the picture.
Yeah.
Toward the.
And I also like it.
Toward the right and the front.
Yeah. In that first picture, I'm not seeing it here, but in the first one, if you're familiar with Upper Manhattan, you can see you're on St. Nicholas Avenue and you're looking west, and it's hard to make out at Shepherd Hall if you know City College campus.
You can see it better
in the background.
So it's background. That's City College.
In the first picture.
So this is right across from City College in 1925.
What did I'm just gonna. I was wondering if if this gathering tells us something about the Harlem Renaissance that people often miss. We have a lot of assumptions about the Harlem Renaissance because it's something in the now 100 years ago. But does this particular gathering that we see in the picture kind of tell us something that?
Yeah, there's a book that came out about 20 years ago now. It's by Stephen Watson, and it's about the Harlem Renaissance. I can't remember the subtitle, but what he's talking about is relationships. That you may think, okay, I'll send this good short story, and that will get me published. But what he talks about is all these connections, personal connections between people. Fisher gets his story published because Pearl introduces him to Hugh Burkhead, who is an Episcopal priest in Baltimore, where Pearl lives. Hugh Burkhead is friends with Ellery Sedgwick, who is the publisher of Atlantic magazine.
So these networks are
Fisher sends him something. I'm sure he didn't send it cold, but Hugh Burkhead probably put a cover note. This is my friend. What do you think? And this picture, the Harlem Renaissance, the telling of it tends to focus on the relationships across the color line, but the relationships among Black people are important too. That's why Regina Anderson's apartment, Dream Haven, was important. People are meeting, they're coming through. Even the salon that Georgia Douglas Johnson had when Fisher was in medical school in DC. Georgia Douglas Johnson has a Saturday night salon in her house in the 20s, and she continues it, I think, for decades. But people are coming through there, meeting each other. Zora Neale Hurston is there. Langston Hughes, I believe, Richard Bruce Nugent. So these relations, when they move to Harlem, they're not strangers. They know each other.
So this image really kind of represents one of the many nexuses of vast networks that are growing among friends and strangers.
Right. And the thing I particularly like about it after the all-male picture is that women are dominant in this picture. And they're playing all kinds. Jesse Fawcett gets, sometimes, it's kind of a stereotypical, the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance. So Jesse Fawcett was she was the literary editor for the Crisis magazine. So if you're sending a poem to the Crisis, it's going through her, and you would want to know her, and that becomes important later.
Gatekeeper, yeah, that's great. You once said to me on another occasion, Rudolph Fisher is not looking at Harlem from above. And that really prompted me to just imagine if Fisher saw Harlem from the sidewalk, the doctor's office, the church pew, the building stoop. What did you mean by that?
That people would look at a Brown University honors graduate, a medical doctor who's writing about Harlem, almost as looking at it from the perspective of a sociologist or a researcher writing about other people. The reality is, for almost all Black people at that time, even with that education, if you look at where they were economically, they are striving, struggling. Fisher, what makes him an insider, even though he wasn't born in New York, he spent a lot of time in New York. From his time in college, his summers would be in New York, and he was a very interested observer, but not from an outsider's point of view.
He wasn't aloof.
It's a curiosity point of view, and the challenge in writing biography of him is this very little, pretty much all of his literature exists, and the manuscripts are at Brown, but there's not a whole lot of him talking about himself in terms of growing up. You know, I suspect he was probably doing that in Providence, you know, whether it's in the barber shop, listening to people, things like that. And that's what he does in Harlem. And so what he also does is he values Black vernacular, but he's traveling in many circles. There's one note that I came across where it said that he became friends with Bessie Smith at Amelia Walker's Stark Tower. And so he's moving in all these circles, and then that appears in his story. So he's, the Walls of Jericho, the first novel, has a glossary, Harlemese glossary of Black slang, because he's using it, but he wants people to understand it. The fact that he knows it means that he's there. But and even in terms of, you know, my work entitled Harlem's Interpreter, he wants people who are reading his work to understand Harlem as he understands it. Because by the time he's published, the bestsellers, like now, are sensational. And he's not saying that sensational things don't happen in the Black community, but it was getting to the point where if it wasn't sensational, then it wasn't considered authentic. And he was challenging that, saying, yeah, there are, you know, rent parties and shootings, those things happen, but there's a lot of day-to-day things in Harlem that have their own interests.
In his novel, The Contraman Dies, one of Fisher's dual protagonists is a medical doctor, as he is. How did being a medical professional shape the way Fisher observed Harlem?
I think it may have shaped it in terms of his analysis, his attention to detail, reading about him at Howard Medical School, a brilliant student. Again, he's struggling. His father died the year he graduates from Brown. His mother seems to have worked as a seamstress, and he ends up teaching embryology while he's in medical school. And one of the notes talking about as he moves forward in his last year, it says he got excellent grades in surgery, but hated it. So this attention to detail, I think, is what he brings. And also as a researcher, he gets to New York with a fellowship to do research. And so when he moves into literature, he's using that, almost the data of observation as content for his stories.
Do you think, did medicine give him access to Harlem life that other writers simply couldn't see, who were not doctors?
Probably. I'm not sure So I'm at the part in my writing where I'm starting to really look at his literature. So I can't say offhand, oh, this story comes from that. But as a physician, you are going to see a range of people. What he might have also seen, rather than just looking at his patients, he might have incorporated his own experience, because the reality is, if you're a Black physician and you're starting out in the late 20s, a few years in, the Depression hits. Black physicians in New York did not have visiting privileges at hospitals. And so what they do is they go into private practice, or they start smaller hospitals, like the International Hospital that he eventually led. That hospital was not successful, and he goes on to do other things. And he struggles. And so it's not inherited wealth that he's writing from. So you could argue it's a different kind of struggle. He was able to buy a house. He bought that house from a friend. And so from a race and real estate point of view, I haven't got to research in that transaction. That is often how Black people get into, quote, all white neighborhoods, is there's a white seller who is very interested in helping them. Mm-hmm. And so what he's experienced, there's a tendency to assume that that's gonna put him at a great distance economically from people. It is a distance, but not as great a distance as people think. And so I think, his struggle probably, he appreciates, it's different from the struggle of somebody, working in a factory or something like that. Yeah. But it's a struggle.
He's a bona fide medical professional. It reminds me, so while we don't know for sure if he was at the Civic Club dinner, he was at the Crisis magazine dinner in 1932. And a book reviewer, his countryman dies, had just come out, and the book reviewers described him in the program for that dinner as Rudolph Fisher knows his Harlemites. To good use also has physician Fisher put his medical training and knowledge. But also describes him as a physician, but his real work is as a fiction writer. And I thought that was interesting. I almost feel a bias. It's like, they have to appreciate that there's a doctor in the house, but it's like they want him to be this other thing,
And I think he wanted to be both.
Yeah.
I'd like to read an opening, one of my favorite openings. This is the beginning of the novel, The Walls of Jericho, 1928. Despite the objections of the dictees, who prefer to ignore the existence of so-called rats, it is of interest to consider Henry Patmore's pool parlor on Fifth Avenue in New York. The truth about Fifth Avenue has only half been told, that it harbors an aristocracy of residents already yielding to an aristocracy of commerce. Has any New Yorker confessed to the rest that when aristocratic Fifth Avenue crosses 110th Street, leaving Central Park behind, it leaves its aristocracy behind as well? Here are bargain stores, babble, and kids, dinginess, odors, thick speech. Fallen from splendor and doubtless ashamed, the avenue burrows into the ground, plunges beneath a park which hides it from 116th to 125th Street. Here it emerges, moving uncertainly northward, a few more blocks, and now, irony of ironies, finds itself in Negro Harlem. You can see the avenue change expression, blankness, horror, conviction. You can almost see it wag its head in self-commiseration. Not just because this is Harlem. There are proud streets in Harlem. 7th Avenue of a Sunday afternoon, Strivers Row, and the Hill. Fifth Avenue's shame lies in having missed that so-called dicty sections. These so-called dicty sections, in having poked its head out into the dark kingdom's backwoods. A city jungle this, if ever there was one, peopled largely by untamed creatures that live and die for the moment only. Accordingly, here strides melodrama, naked and unashamed. And that kicks off the novel that it said he wrote on a bet that he could not write a novel that included, quote, the low life and the high life of Harlem. And so it's all there in this plot. And so that's Walls of Jericho, 1928.
And I love that because you use a couple of words from like the glossary that he describes as Harlemese.
Right.
I think we might have, many of you at a disadvantage. So he uses the term dictee, which many of you, who doesn't know what dictee is? Okay, we'll explain, but then we have to kill you, okay?
Most people don't know.
Right. Or rats, which is the opposite. So they're both blacks, and a lot of his work is about addressing sort of the colorism issue. But dictees were kind of sort of high, upper class or elites, assuming blacks, and the rats were just kind of like regular folks, And he used them both like in one sentence there. So I love that, he wrote fluently. I was impressed, reading that. And in that same opening section, he talks about the emergence of Fifth Avenue, which Fifth Avenue is iconic in itself, disappearing into a different kind of Fifth Avenue above 110th Street. And I remember when I first read that, I got really excited because my grandparents, that's where my father grew up on Fifth Avenue, but not Jackie Onassis' Fifth Avenue, the other one. So I said, I know that street. But he wrote fluently in both this sort of literary English and Harlemese. What was he trying to accomplish with that blend of voices? He didn't go for one or the other.
Yeah.
He didn't write in dialect, and he didn't write strictly in sort of fluid.
I mean, if he's going to present a full picture of the community, it's all of that. It's all of that. And my work before this is focused on community formation of Black people in Harlem, mainly 1890 to 1920. And in a way, I'm trying to do the same thing as a historian in those books. So Race and Real Estate. What I was doing is challenging the notion that when you have a Black community, it is just a collection of people, Black people. And so some of that, the term the ghetto, when that began to be popularized, particularly into the 40s and onward, probably, that what it did was allow people to sidestep an analysis of a Black community, that what it might look like from the outside is very different when you're walking those streets. And so I think one of my attractions to Fisher, I am not brilliant like him, and I write, I try to write well, but I have a BA in economics from Harvard, I have an MBA from Columbia, my doctorate is from CUNY Grad Center, and there is almost kind of, when I say that, people would think, well, this is how you're going to view the world. But as my career before academia was in community development. And so I was in Cleveland, walking those streets, thinking about, okay, how did this neighborhood get this way, and how can we bring it, revitalize it? But particularly in Harlem, where I worked for several years. And when I was in the MBA program at Columbia, the summer between my first and second year, I worked for a downtown real estate firm, and they hired 3 interns, all of us in MBA programs. One focused on Lower Fifth Avenue, one focused on Soho, and I focused on Harlem. And what we were asked to do is take the Sanborn block and lot map, walk every block in that neighborhood and color code that map. And so I walked from 110th Street to 155th Street, river to river, over the course of the summer, and got to know Harlem really well. And got to hear Harlem, hear different things, and so at having drinks with Henry and Blanche Canal, Alfred and Blanche Canal. And so he's traveling in these different worlds. And that's what appears in his, that's what allows him to write in the way he's writing, is because he knows, even if he's only writing about Black people, there's a full range of Blackness, both in terms of color,
and
experiences, class, all of those
Do you think
things.
he might have been consciously though trying to invent a Black urban literary voice, or
Yeah. I don't think he was, I do not think that he was trying to influence others. Like, he's a radiologist, like it's something he could do
Right.
his own writing done.
Yeah.
He's not part of a school like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who have a common patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason, who wants
Patrons who are
primitive things, and they're trying to serve her. He's old. He's 5 years older than Langston Hughes. He's married and has a child. He doesn't have time to be like kowtowing. So he's going to write what he's going to write. But I think it's for his satisfaction, which I believe he hoped would satisfy many other people, Black and white.
When we look at Fisher's life, how much of the Harlem Renaissance was built through institutions rather than through art alone?
I think it's difficult to separate the institutions from the art. People were writing, they were writing stories, novels, plays, but what makes the Harlem Renaissance this explosion? And I know there's a lot of criticism about, well, was it really important in that? But it's linking those producers of art with publishers, with the Urban League, with the NAACP, that's what provides that fuel.
Yeah.
That leads us
Yeah, I
to
guess I'm
talk
wondering
about
how important were places like churches and hospitals and civic organizations
I mean,
to the movement?
they appear in the art, and they are often venues where the artists perform and present their work. Regina Anderson was the librarian at the Harlem Branch Library that becomes the Schomburg Center. And so that institution has like several levels of importance, from archive, literacy, but also the theater that is birthed there on the lower level, all of those things. And the YMCA as well, similar. So they're playing really important roles in terms of production.
Do you know, can you talk a little bit more about him, so not as a writer, but as a doctor? What was his role at the International Hospital?
He was in charge of it. He was a superintendent, so that meant he was managing it.
And what does the hospital tell us about Black professional life and community building in Harlem during the 1920s and 30s?
I mean, the hospital existed because Black doctors did not have the ability to work in most white hospitals. And so they create, so Amelia Walker's third husband, I believe, Whitey Wilson, he opens a hospital.
Right.
He's a physician too. And so it's not unusual.
It was also buried here. It's not an ad, but it's kind of a plug.
But what it tells, so it tells how entrepreneurship is often the avenue to follow when other roads are blocked. But entrepreneurship is a challenge. The International Hospital closes after a little more than a year, and it had followed the Vincent Sanatorium, which that same building, Conrad Vincent was a physician.
He's here too.
Yeah, so some of it is like the struggle that Black people who are very well educated and are very ambitious have. And I know, like in this political moment, when there's a notion that discrimination isn't happening, people are not all that, they're not trying to hide that they're discriminating against Black people then. And so if you're ambitious, you've got to figure out a way around it, through it, and physicians are not an exception to having to deal with that.
And so he's working at a place that's filling a particular niche that immediate community, Harlem.
At the beginning of the Depression,
Yeah, at the beginning of the Depression.
unemployment in the Black community was 50% during the Depression.
So as I mentioned, Fish is among many Harlem Renaissance era residents who are still surrounding us here at Woodlawn Cemetery. What connections did he have to others who are here? And I'm thinking who also was prominent, like Dr. Louis T. Wright. He's also in the booklet.
Louis T. Wright was his physician.
Oh, okay.
In
That's
his,
good. Yeah.
He's the one who
Right.
signs.
Oh, right, he's on the death certificate.
He signs
Yes.
Fisher's death certificate. I do want to say that one of the things my book, when it does come out, I hope will set straight is Rudolph Fisher did not die of cancer. I'll read. So there is an unpublished biography by Dr. Calvin Sinnett that's at Moreland's Fine Art Collection at Howard. And he was a physician too. And
Was cancer an assumption because of the work that he did as an
I
X-ray
think so, but I don't know where
technician?
that came
Yeah.
from because it's not from the death certificate. It was inflammation of the gallbladder that led to abdominal adhesions that led to a blood infection that led to his death. And so if you think about the racing car driver who was in his early 40s and died suddenly a few weeks ago, that was sepsis. And that's what Calvin Sinnett says he suspects is what happened. And one thing that happens with historians that we have to be very mindful of is not going to the source. And so I don't know where that cancer result came from, but it's been copied over and over again. And there's a death certificate signed by Louis T. Wright that says something very different. And the reason that's important, a brilliant physician, yes, we learn new things about things, but even at the beginning of radiology, I'm sure there was an understanding of the danger of exposure. I believe Marie Curie died from that, but she's at the very beginning in the 1800s. This is a generation later. And so what it doesn't do is give Fisher the credit for knowing his specialty enough to protect himself. And what that, I can't say what the inspiration for that assumption is, but what it feels like is an assumption that no matter how brilliant you are, you're still gonna make like elementary mistakes.
Yeah.
And I'll read what Calvin Sinnett says. In the era before antibiotics, newer surgical technologies, and sophisticated monetary desires, it was not an unknown way for someone to die. He's talking about the way that Fisher died. It's 1934 when he died. The profession he respected and loved so dearly was unable to prevent his untimely death. He was 37 years old. He was not expected to die. He had had surgeries. He seemed to be coming forward with it. This is Christmas time of 1934. He dies December 26, 1934. When I interviewed Jane Ryder, she did not talk about it, and I didn't ask her about that, but I'm in touch with Fisher had one son. That son died in 1964 at the age of about 38 of heart problems. That son had one daughter, and I'm in touch with her. And she is thanking me because the things I'm telling her, what I've focused on in the first half of the book, is the things that really do not appear about Fisher, that typical biographies start him in Providence. His father was 50 when he was born. His mother was 40. He had a brother that was 20 years older. He had a sister, Pearl is, I believe, about 8 years older. There was a whole life that family lived before he was born in the latter part of the 1800s, and it's in the South. His father was born in Nashville. His parents meet in Memphis in the 1870s during the Reconstruction period. They eventually moved to Arkansas, and they're farming, like most black people in the South are, in the 1880s. That's the life that they're living. His father eventually goes into the ministry. His father appears in the public records because his father is a person who challenges things when they don't go his way. And so there are legal cases that he's involved in. It's like, ooh. And so you're a child growing up in that environment. Fisher never went beyond the Mason-Dixon line. He had a really abhorrent view of the South. And I can't say exactly why, but there is some information that suggests that his father told him about things that had happened to the family, and he decided not to go back. And it's really interesting that his first story in Atlantic Monthly in February 1925 is called The City of Refuge. And the City of Refuge, and it opens with the main character, King Solomon Gillis, on the run from North Carolina, where he's killed a white man. And he arrives takes the train, is able to get on the train, takes the subway from Penn Station to 135th Street, one of the main stops in Harlem, and he's coming out of the subway station there into the sunlight, and he's just dazzled and by all these black people. And then what makes it even more is a black policeman. There's this, and like rereading that, which I did recently, it kind of reminded me of Fisher's like really negative feelings about Solomon Gillis is running from the South. that Fisher didn't want to have anything to do with.
Right.
And so
Culture
this
shock.
story, like his first story, has all of that, but also has kind of what's in The Walls of Jericho, all the voices of Harlem street life, and I won't give the whole thing away, but I can't remember what your question was now. But did I answer it?
I don't remember either. No, but it was interesting nevertheless. Well, actually, because I want to give some time for question and answers, but I want to say, neither you nor Rudolph Fisher were Harlem born. Both of you arrived as adults and spent years interpreting Harlem for others. Do you feel any kinship with Fisher in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what I'm saying about, like, sometimes people will ask me, why Fisher? And, I know what the Ivy League, so by the time I got to Harvard, it was fall of 1975, there were probably about 100 black students in my class out of a class of 1,600, but I still felt what Du Bois, that description that Du Bois gives of his time at Harvard, in but not of, is how he described it. And there's still that feeling, so I can kind of think about what that was for Fisher. Fritz Pollard does write about his experience, and that's what I use to look at how Fisher's experience was. So things like that. Yeah.
And I like that in but not of. What can an outsider or a newcomer sometimes notice about Harlem that lifelong residents might take for granted? Is there a certain advantage to be
yes,
in but not of?
There's a way that when you are born in a place, you take you may take things for granted that an outsider just rebels in, like, what? And I'll use myself as an example. So I graduated from business school in 1984. I got interested in Harlem the first week I was in New York in 1982, got interested in the Harlem Renaissance, and continued to read a lot of the literature that we've been talking about while I was in business school. And 6 years later, after I graduated in 1990, I opened a gift shop on 125th and 5th Avenue called Home to Harlem, named after Claude McKay's, I think it's 1925 novel also. And I remember there was a person, I won't name them, but they were a leader in Harlem, and they called, I knew them, and they asked to meet with me. And they were really angry. I had just been open for a little while. I took out a second mortgage on a co-op apartment to fund it. And this person was angry that I was doing this. And I'm sitting there like, what is this about? And I'm feeling like, Kevin from Podunk, Toledo, like this man is trying to. Right. And I just listened, and I didn't say anything because it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know why you're so angry. And then when I left, I thought through it a little bit more, and I think that the person wanted me to ask them for their permission to do this.
Because they were all
and it's like, you were positioned. I didn't say this, but I thought about it. Like, you should have been doing this, and the fact that I did. And you didn't, that's on you. So, I'm not saying that people who live in a place can't appreciate it, but sometimes we don't. And so sometimes somebody coming from the outside might do that. And the same kind of resentment I experience, they experience too. And I felt that I had watched enough people get off of buses and turn around in circles trying to figure out what they should get. And so this was a gift shop that had Harlem-themed products. It was open for about a year and a half, but I probably wouldn't be here today if I hadn't done it. Because I did book events, I did book parties, readings, I met all these people. Dr. William Sorrell was in the front row. He talked about Henrietta Benton Davis, who was of the Marcus Garvey UNIA movement at that shop. And that got me thinking about scholarship while I was working in community development for the next 6 years. And so that's not a direct answer to your question, but there's a way that, in a way, it caused me to lean even deeper in to understanding Harlem.
By being an outsider from the beginning.
I
get that.
I'm not a Harlem-born person, but I know a lot about Harlem that a lot of other people don't know. And I'm not doing that in a braggadocious way, but...
Well, you put in the time, and I think often when you're born in a place, you don't put in the time, you assume the time is part of you because you were born there, which is, you realize you're always, you're pulled up short when somebody knows something that you were here all the time to know it yourself, but it's just kind of like you didn't.
Right, but
you didn't lean into it because it was there.
No, but I also want to, kind of extend that often it's not their fault that they don't know.
Yeah.
I know I had privilege. It's not money that came with those degrees, but it did open some doors, and so I was able to do some things that other people might not have had an opportunity to do, even if they wanted to, and I recognize that. But what I try to do in my writing, I'm thinking this is going to make it easier for people who do want to know about the community where they live. That, the same thing I'm interested in. Rudolph Fisher, most people have not heard of him, and I believe they should. And
that's a perfect lead for my last question. What do you think is maybe the most underappreciated thing about Rudolph Fisher today? I'm sure there are several underappreciated things, but what do you think? What maybe strikes you as the most salient?
2 novels, over 12 short stories, while working as a radiologist, raising a child, the new Negro. It's hard to do that if that's the main thing, that literature, just if that's the main thing, but he's doing all of that. And then the more I learn about his life, there's a level of struggle that he pushes through too. And so it's not one thing, it's really kind of, and then he's a musician. He was arranging music for Paul Robeson. All of these talents, he is a Renaissance man, and that's something literally in terms of what he can do.
Right. Because I think many of us know him as it's a name that we're familiar with, but we don't appreciate this stuff that goes with the name, that hangs on the name, the writing, the medicine, the associations, the personal associations, like Robeson and what have you. Thank you so much. I appreciate all I've learned. Let's open.
Thank you for this. This was amazing. I did not know about Rudolph Fisher at all. So thank you. Are you doing anything to help correct the misunderstanding about how he died for the public record?
Do that. I gotta be strategic, that I don't want to I may write an article, but I do have to be careful about how much you put out of a book that's coming out before it gets out there. But that may be something to focus on, because I see it over and over again.
Previous to my work, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, black folks were impeccably dressed. Black people were impeccably dressed. They looked gorgeous. And I want to know why. Why did black folk back then feel it was important to look and dress well? Men had on hats, women wore dresses, men wore a hard shoe, not a sneaker and a cap. And I think we need to return to that period. I'm just curious as to what you think.
I can't remember which museum, about black men in dress. And super fun, yes. So clothes, what kind of, there's a saying, clothes defines the man or whatever. Black people understood from slavery time what clothes will do in terms of how we are perceived. And part of the reason they understood it, because slave owners were trying to police what they wore. So women couldn't wear certain colors that were associated with white people. They wanted people to dress down. So in freedom, we understand that. I've got this jacket on today because I want to honor you, honor Woodlawn, and I know what a jacket says. And I'm a black man who I know in some settings, if I don't have that on, people may be asking me, if I'm in a retail store, they may be asking me where this or that is, just because I'm a skinny man, and they figure, oh, you must work here. And so clothes, that's what they're doing. And I do think the tension now is that often gets written off as respectability politics, or that almost like it's a meaningless thing. And I understand the tension, because you have to have a certain amount of money to dress a certain way, but not necessarily, because Goodwill has very good things. And I've gotten plenty of classic suits from those kinds of places. But that's really what that's about. And so, even this beginning image here is one of the few times, this is one of the few images you'll see of Rudolph Fisher without, it's in the promotion. There's a picture where he doesn't have a tie on. That's about the only one that I've seen when he doesn't have a tie on. And some of that is, like, we have cameras on our phone now, so it's much more casual. But people taking a picture meant something different. Like, even like this party, they all have suits and ties on, and the women have nice dresses. And they're all friends, so they don't have to impress each other, but you do feel a certain way when you have something that you know looks good. And why not? And also I interviewed, I live in Yellow Springs, Ohio now, where Antioch College is. And I interviewed a woman, she passed away recently, but she was about 100 years old almost. And she talked about putting her daughter in a private school in Yellow Springs. The black woman, her daughter had hair down her shoulders. It wasn't permed or anything like it, it was just natural hair. And she said the people at the school, this is a progressive community, predominantly white school, they approached her about cutting her daughter's hair. This woman was a seamstress. That girl looked good every day she went there. And that made them uncomfortable. They wouldn't, I'm sure they would not acknowledge it. And she said, "You're not gonna cut her hair." I know that's what that was about. That even in progressive communities, there's a hierarchy that they'd like to maintain. And they don't want a black person looking better than them. And that's what that was about. And if she had told anybody, actually she may have told her friends that, but if she had told a white person that, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I bet they would have said, "Oh, you must have misunderstood. No, they couldn't have done that." But there's all kinds of ways that we are demeaned by what we wear, or is provocative. Some of those people who were lynched in the summer of 1919 were black men in uniform. What does a uniform do? It unifies us. And they're saying the white people are saying, we don't want you unified with us. And black men knew that's what that meant. So clothes, they really do. They mean something. Yeah, dressing up as resistance.
Rudolph Fisher looking at the community of Harlem in all of these layered ways. And I'm just curious, our own upbringing in Toledo, Ohio, and the black community there. I mean, is there any correlation between the area, the community we grew up in, see that in Rudolph Fisher's perspective and descriptions of Harlem?
Yes, very much so. So
Talk about
the first house that we lived in Toledo was 1025 Avondale. And last year, when I was cleaning out the house of one of our cousins, I found online a picture of that house in the 30s. And that neighborhood was predominant, all the people on the street were white. We lived there probably from the late 50s until 1964, and it had flipped. So for me, my interest in race and real estate comes from, we moved to Adams Township, which was just outside of the city of Toledo. It was, my guess is maybe at that time 60 or 70% white, 40, 30% black. It was annexed into the city, and within a couple of years, the neighborhood was predominantly black. And so, looking back, thinking about that, got me interested in race and real estate in terms of what Rudolph Fisher is writing about. So Dorr Street was the main black commercial corridor in Toledo, and urban renewal destroyed it. And that never made sense to me because it was a thriving community. But as a scholar, I began to understand that from the outside, people were looking at that neighborhood and people hanging out as something negative. But if you look at Jane Jacobs and what she talks about in terms of eyes on the street, those are safer streets when you have people out there. And what that has to do with Fisher is you know, our parents, my father was a public school teacher, my mother was a nurse. So they had education, but there were 5 kids in our family. So we were living a working class life and moving around between these different communities. I do see, like Fisher, he's got classical high school education, but he's going home to a neighborhood that he's at one time living in a house next to the church where his father is pastor. When he's at Brown, he's not living on campus. He's living at home because he can't afford to. And so I'm thinking about what that means both in terms of class, but also in terms of how he writes about Black people. It may be humorous, but he's not laughing at them. He's respecting their differences, identifying that, and that's what I hope I'm seeing. Like, I feel that when I think about my own experience, both in Toledo and in Harlem, that I never would have imagined I would have lived in New York. But it's, in Paul Laurence Dunbar's book, The Sport of the Gods, he has this chapter that begins, to the provincial coming to New York for the first time. And then he talks about what it feels like that the person doesn't know anybody, but then in a week they're meeting people, and pretty soon when they are gone, they want to get back because they love it. And that's what Fisher was describing, and that's what I felt. Mm-hmm.
3 more questions, I'm going to go Lala, and then up to the front, and then over to the south.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you, my 2 favorite historians here who continue to put a microscope on elements of Harlem that we need to absolutely know more about. It's not enough to do this sort of glossy, this is that. So thank you both for what you do. I am particular about Rudolph Fisher. As you both know, I chair Literary Society, and we just spent the last few hours with Madam C.J. Walker and Aurelia Walker, and today is Aurelia's Bundle's birthday, so I'm celebrating all of that. But one of the things that I think about in terms of Rudolph Fisher, when I discovered that where his gravesite was, and I really thank Woodlawn, because they have always been really not only amenable, but really thoughtful about helping me connect up some of these dots. But when I figured out where Rudolph was buried, the Literary Society came here, a good 25 or 30 of us, to have the book discussion at his gravesite. And that was The Conjure Man Dies. My question, because I have not read Fisher's entire body of work, but he always struck me, as one of those writers whose work really did, in many ways, detail what Harlem felt and looked like, because he would. And I can't think of, when I think about The Conjure Man Dies, I think about 130th Street, and I walk through there. Every time I walk through there, I think about Fisher. And of course, I look for the address. That building doesn't really exist, but I walk through there, and I always think about The Conjure Man Dies. So my question then is, are there all the other works, are all or most of them connected in specific places as he does with that? I know he does it a lot in his work, but I'm not sure about the entire body of work.
I think most of them, they're almost all set in Harlem, and once you do that, like he's writing in the 20s when people are shining a light on it. Once you place it there, you have to understand the geography of it. And that's what I mean by him knowing Harlem as an insider, because you can't do that if you don't. I mean, there's one error that Eric pointed out in the passage that I read, that he talks about Fifth Avenue, how does he put it? he says it burrows beneath a park which hides 116th to 125th. That's Mount Morris Park. And so it's really 120th to 125th. But that's, you know, a minor error that Ellery Sedgwick would, if, I don't know who they are, actually this is a Canop book, that Alfred Canop could not help him with. But that kind of knowledge allows him to set it there, and for people who are from Harlem to read it and know he knows what he's talking about, both in terms of geography, but also the language. I do not keep up with slang, even though I teach, because I know what it looks like. You know, I'm 68. Like, what am I going to be looking like trying to use the language? But this language, you have to know it well enough so that people feel it's authentic. And so in the 20s, that's what he was doing. And he was able to do it because he went to a lot of different places.
Fisher, the musician, do you have any specifics about his training?
Calvin Sinnett suggests that he applied to Harvard but did not get in. The reason why he graduates from Brown in 1919, and he then got a master's in biology from Brown a year later. His BA degree was in English and biology, so he had an interest from the beginning in both. He gets that master's degree in biology to strengthen his candidacy. That wasn't enough to get into Harvard. Dr. Sinnett also says that during that summer, he also took a course in physics, which that was at Brown. So he's trying to make sure he's a good candidate. At Howard, he has a very close relationship with the dean of the medical school, Dean Edward Bollock. And there is correspondence about this where Fisher is struggling economically. I mentioned his father had died, and Dean Bollock knows he's a very good student, and that's how he gets the offer to teach embryology to dental students. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying his medical training. So sorry. What I've been able to determine is that Providence Public Schools have very good music programs. Just like when I was growing up, we had very good instrumental music programs. So it's unusual now, but it wasn't so unusual then. He had a piano in the home. And that wasn't, it was a middle class kind of thing, but it wasn't that unusual that many middle class people had pianos and they knew how to play them. He understood music theory, and that's what I haven't been able to determine where he got that training. I don't know if it was it may have been at classical high school, but I can't verify that. The fact that he's arranging music and arranging it for Paul Robeson, I have not found any of it, but I'm looking.
Do you know if there was any cross-pollination musically with Cicely Jones and like Patty? Because wasn't she based in Providence?
I have not.
So her career was kind of waning at that point, but I don't know how old he is when he's in Providence, but I'm wondering if there were just musical programs that maybe she had, or people surrounding her had kind of established that he might have.
It's Cicely Jones was a very well-known black singer who was in Providence. I haven't come across that, but now that you mention, I'll look for that too then. One account said that when he practiced for 2 to 3 hours at a time. I'm sure he wasn't doing that every day, but he was a serious musician. And another account says about the only argument he had with Pearl was when they were closing up a house, she took the piano and he wanted that piano. And so he was a serious musician.
My question, I have 2 questions, quite a few, but first I want to say that my background is I'm from Los Angeles, And there was a time as a classically trained tap dancer working with the Nichols brothers that I wore a tuxedo 3 times a weekend. At CAA, which is the most elite entertainment agency in the world, I wore a 3-piece for 2 years, every single day. And my question is, I have 2 questions. A, do you think there's a disconnect between these stories reaching people of my generation, especially when, I guess by looking at me today, they see a hat on and a black jacket and some jeans, and when they judge and ask how come I can't dress like Rudolph Fisher did or Langston Hughes? So my question to you is, why do you think there's a disconnect between these figures becoming heroes to people in my, well, they're my heroes, but to others of my generation, and then also being a person that wants to see these things become films and television shows, who do you think, how do we plan to reach the younger generation of not just African Americans, but people across the cultures with these stories, and why do you think, and do you think there's a disconnect, especially if one might judge you and not be able to connect with you?
Rudolph Fisher stories have been collected. The first collection was in 1987. The collection is called The City of Refuge, and the editor is Robert McCluskey. There are some other collections. Those collections, I would say, have been marketed towards scholarly audiences rather than general audiences. With this Fisher biography, my hope is to get a trade publisher who would then reach a broader audience. That's one of the reasons. So the 2 books I published on my own, well, not on my own, but as a single author, were done through Columbia University Press, and they have a certain audience they're looking for. And it often is not the young people you're talking about. And so that's something to explore. What you also mentioned in terms of the visual side of it, so Eric sent me a reel that somebody did on Philip Payton, and it's a very talented reel in about 2 minutes that focuses on his life, but a fair amount of what they have in terms of fact is not right. And it was, I can't say why they did it that way, but what it showed me is something, it kind of proved what I already know, is that that's a way to reach a new audience. What I thought about doing is reaching out to that person and giving them my book, or maybe writing a script to mirror their script, but with the right facts. Because that's how Rudolph Fisher ends up being thought of as dying of cancer, is because somebody who had a wide reach put in an assumption, and everybody's been running with it ever since. I do think that the younger generation is more likely to be captured by visuals. And I think once you do that, then they could go and look at the literature. That literature has to be published probably in platforms that know how to reach them. And the scholarly publishers, they're not trying to do that. And so your point is really well taken, because what we've been saying is people don't know him, and they're not gonna know him unless we broaden that market. In terms of people looking down on people and how they're dressed, these people were people of their times, and you are of your generation, of your time. And so I'm not looking at you expecting you to be here in a suit and tie. And so I don't think that should be a barrier. Like, if they're at a barbecue at that house in Queens that Fisher and his wife purchased, like when you saw the pictures of Jane, she's very casual, kind of lounging and stuff. And so part of it too is for us to understand them as full humans. They're not in suit and ties all the time. And that's going to really help us think about how your generation can do what they did as well. Because what happens when we put them on a pedestal is people start saying, well, I could not do that. And it's like, yes, you could. They were people who got some doors open, and that can happen for you as well. And so I appreciate your question, and it's definitely something that I want to work on with this because it needs to reach a broad audience. Thank you.